guys.
Hello.
Hello, and welcome back to Brokenness Meets Grace. As you all know, I'm Harmony.
And I am Garabo.
And we are Team BMG. Team Brokenness Meets Grace. So welcome back, guys. We are in our third season of Brokenness Meets Grace.
I know.
And we're starting a new series, a new season of the podcast. And
yes.
This time around, we've gone through brokenness and what it means. That was season 1. Season 2, we explored identity and brokenness. So what does it mean to be broken, and what sort of identities do we develop around brokenness, and etc.
Yeah.
Season 3, we are talking about broken heroes of the Bible. So, we think about heroes from the Bible and we think about the benchmark, right? The standard to which God chose people and how they behaved and how they act and how their faith, the story of their faith essentially speaks to the standard we must maintain. We look up to them, we want to be like them, the stories of victory and triumph with difficulties, etc. And we see that as that's the ultimate disciple, that's the ultimate servant of God. And we look at them from a place of reverence, a place of awe, we respect them, we admire them. But this time we're going to talk about the fact that they were people just like you and us, you and I, and they had flaws and they had brokenness, and we want to talk about that.
No, I'm excited. I think Harmony said, a lot of us grow up hearing about these heroes in the Bible. A lot of us grow up hearing about, your Davids who killed slaves, giants, your, Moses who parted Red Seas, and great stories, great heroes, great men. But I think what we forget to see, or what is often not portrayed, is just how human they are, right? Or how human they were. And it's a side of us that I think most of us don't like to show that often, just how imperfect we are, just how fallible we are, and just how it may look nice, but there's a whole lot that happens for us to get to where it looks like. But even then, when you're there, it's still not all together. It's still not perfect. It's still fractured. It's still, imperfect. But God loves us exactly that way too. We are still useful for Him, even in our imperfections. And I think this particular segment just really, we want to shed light on that. We want to highlight just how we're in good company, basically, with all these heroes. We're all in the same company because we are all broken, but we are still usable vessels for God.
For His glory. And I think that's the beauty about God's glory and His story. It's His story, right? Is the fact that, He could have chosen these perfect people. He could have chosen if they existed. But that's the real problem. They don't exist. Yeah. These perfect people do not exist. So He literally has a board of tokens in the form of people who are broken, and that's all He can use. So we just want to highlight that in this season, to make us remember that even these people that we have revered for so long, we read about the stories of Paul, we read about the stories of Joseph and Moses, and most of the time we think about these people and the good things that they did for Christianity, the good things that they did for the mission and the ministry, but we want to look at, on the flip side of that, their brokenness. And how did God take that and actually use it for His glory? Because we glorify Him through what they did, ultimately. But they were broken people doing great things.
So let's dive in, right? So our first broken hero of the Bible is Moses. Moses is the MVP of the day. And we know Moses' story. We grew up hearing about it. We've watched, I think, The Prince of Egypt 100 times.
We're still watching it.
It's such a beautiful story. One of the most touching and emotional stories of the Bible for me, and just wow, it's heavy, it's packed, the entire story. But let's talk about him before he became the MVP, right? The Moses the Great that we know today. So let's go back in time quickly, right? So we're in Egypt, thousands of years ago, and this is the time where the Hebrew people, or the Israelites, are being oppressed by the Egyptians. Okay, so Joseph, the great Joseph, has died, and the Hebrews are now slaves. And the oppression was so dire that children were being slaughtered by the Pharaoh at that point, because he was intimidated, or he was fearful that the population of the Hebrew people was just getting so out of hand that, you know what, he wanted to get rid of the Hebrew people. And he created a decree or a law that basically allowed baby boys to be killed, to be thrown in the river and be eaten by crocodiles, right? So it's a time where it's turmoil, it's it's a massacre basically. God had promised the Israelites, God had promised to free the Hebrew people, right? And this is a promise that literally took hundreds of years to be fulfilled. But this is where Moses comes into the play, because he is now the child born into this chaos, but God uses him as the vessel to be the chosen person. But nobody knows this. Nobody knows that he's going to free these people. Nobody expects freedom to come in a form of a baby, right? So for me, that is one aspect I really respect about the story. That, can you imagine Moses' mother in that moment taking the faith to believe that, you know what, there's something special about this baby, right? Babies are dying left, right, and center. But you believe in your spirit and your soul that this particular baby is special, and you're going to do all that you can to protect and save this baby. And this is really what happened. So Moses was saved by his mother Jochebed, and she built like a basket for him, right? And she put him in a basket on the river Nile, and he was not eaten by any crocodile. He was just going on his merry way on this river until the Pharaoh's daughter found him on the river in the basket. And she was having her bath. And for me, like, that speaks to God and purpose. And
you can't, crocodiles can't eat your purpose. Like, purpose can't be, you know what I mean? Like, God counters everything that happens.
But the fact that she was there at that particular time in that moment, and this child wasn't crying, right? Moses was just dead quiet. And the minute the Pharaoh's daughter sees this basket and picks up this baby, that's when he starts crying. You know, so this whole time he was just a silent baby having a nice ride on the river. And once this woman picks him up and she claims him as his own, basically. And she's like, you know what, this is now my son. I'm going to call him Moses. She was actually the one to name him Moses, FYI. So his maternal mother didn't name him. It was actually the Pharaoh's daughter to name him Moses. And Moses is actually an Egyptian name, if you didn't know.
Wow.
It's an Egyptian name. It comes from one of their gods, right? But as well, the Hebrew names means freedom or deliverer. It also has two meanings in Egypt and Hebrew. Right. So it's a twofold name.
Awesome.
And he was basically raised an Egyptian for 40 years. And he grew up in royalty. He grew up as the second to the throne, right? Because his mother was the wife or the daughter of Pharaoh. I'm not really sure. In Egypt, it's quite hectic, right? How royalty works. So Pharaoh would marry his daughters because they wanted to carry the lineage of royalty. Okay, so every time that a Pharaoh's wife would die, he would marry whatever daughter was available to him. Okay, so it was normal then. So Moses' mother is, it is said to, people believe that she was Pharaoh's daughter, but she was also his wife at the time. So she was very closely knit into the royal space. And Moses grew up in that space. You know, Moses grew up with the silver spoon, you know, in his mouth. He grew up with the luxuries of being a prince, right? And royalty for Egyptians was basically like being a god. And they were revered to that level.
Like a deity.
You were seen as a deity. You were worshipped as a deity. They believed that basically a king, a pharaoh, would stood in place for them between the god and them. They were like the intercessors. The intercessors. You know, so they were worshipped to that level. And, you know, he grew up in a space like that where he was just around people who worshipped him, and he was doted on, he was loved, he was seen as a god. You know, he had all these great experiences. He went through to the best schools. He was given the best education, because Egypt as well was known for very, very good education and intellect and smarts. You know, they created and formed all sorts of technology at the time, and they were really one of the best countries or tribes in the world at the time. So he really grew up with the privilege of knowing a lot of stuff. He was very well educated. And can you imagine the type of lifestyle that must have been like for him? And he knew no better. He didn't know he was a Hebrew. He grew up believing that he was Egyptian, you know. And can you imagine pride? I'm sure he was a very proud person. Right? Can you
Privilege.
Right?
Yeah.
Privilege. That's the word for it. And he's surrounded by slaves and people who are mistreated. And for him, that was normal. You know, somebody just serving him at hand and foot was normal. And that was his lifetime for 40 years. That was how he lived. And he was basically an adult when things changed for him. So it wasn't this thing where he was still growing up and it was reformative years. He was a fully grown adult. That's all he knew. You know, and then God came and shifted up for him, but we'll get there later on. But for me, just understanding the context of how he became the great Moses 80 years later is so important, because there's a lot of character development that happened in the 80 years. And that's another thing. It took him 80 years to get to the purpose that God gave him, right? So he was 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in the wilderness. And thereafter, 80 years later, God told him to go back and free his tribe. So
that's crazy.
It was a whole lot of character development. And of course, we know the reason he then went into the wilderness was because he killed an Egyptian, because something clicked in that moment for him. He saw the abuse of these slaves. He saw them being mistreated, and anger arose in him, and he wanted to, you know, I read something, or somebody said that he believed in his spirit that he was meant to be a redeemer, right? Or a savior. But he acted very quickly. He acted in haste. And the timing was very off. And that's why it looked like rage. It looked like violence. It looked like, you know, anger, because it was misplaced. It wasn't the right time. It wasn't the right way. He wasn't prepared spiritually and emotionally to free his people.
Into that place,
to step into his calling. So he killed an Egyptian soldier, and he was basically exiled from Egypt, and he ran away. Guilt and shame came into the play, and he hid. You know, he thought he could hide from God. He thought he could hide from everybody, and he became a shepherd. Now listen to the contrast of this, right? He was an Egyptian prince, a god, royalty, and he literally became a shepherd. And now shepherds in that time were like lowly, right? They were pretty much on the same level as slaves. They were dirty, you know, they were like at the bottom of the food chain. They were nobodies. Right? And this is what he decided to live as. This is the persona he decided to adopt, because he wasn't in the palace anymore. He was trying to run away from the things that he did. And God allowed him to step into that particular role so he could fix an element of his pride, I believe, an element of his, you know, upbringing, and to just give him two completely differing,
contrasted viewpoints,
experiences, right? So 40 years again, he was a shepherd. He met his wife Zipporah. He had 2 sons, and God called him while he was relaxed and thinking that, you know what, I'm okay. I'm good. I made it. I've done it all. And God is like, okay, I think it's time for you to go back now. You know, you've done your training. You know, you've gotten your stripes.
Your character has been built.
Your character has been built. I fixed something in you, and I need you to now go free the people
Yeah, that is
80 years later.
And it's amazing how, you know, the 80 years part is what stands out for me. So often, I think, you know, on our work in Christianity, people paint the picture that God shows up. And like, we really need to drill down. And I think we're going to do that a lot when we talk about these heroes. The timelines.
Yeah.
I think it's so important for us to really talk about the timelines, you know. Things just didn't happen overnight for these people, you know. Paul didn't become Saul in a day.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Moses wasn't the prince of Egypt and then the deliverer in a day.
David, it took him years to become king.
The king, you know, after he was proclaimed or anointed king by Samuel. Right? So we really need to just hone in on time, because God's time does not work the way our time works. But so often as people, we want to go from broken to grace in a heartbeat. So true. You know, we want to get from you know, our waiting season to the place that we're promised, to success overnight. But we need to understand God's timing goes with a lot of things. It goes with character refinement. Moses killed that Egyptian because, like you said, he felt in his spirit. Anyways, these are deductions.
Yes.
We were not in Moses' head. We don't know what he was thinking or what motivated him to kill the guy. But I would like to imagine that maybe there was a sense of purpose weighing down on him, and watching all of the things that were happening around when he found out that these are my people, you know, that tipped him over and that pushed him over the edge, and maybe that's why he did it. But timing wasn't right. He didn't go from killing this guy to be the redeemer of the Israelites. And I think even in that moment, maybe he didn't even understand fully the scope of the fact that he was actually chosen from birth to be the one that would free them. But timing was off, and it's so important for us to focus on that we cannot rush ahead of God and like fast track our process of growth. No matter how uncomfortable a season is, no matter how tired we are of feeling broken and feeling, worthless and feeling this heavy burden on us, we need to understand that God does everything in his time.
And it's not only timing. I think a lot of us think timing means we sit and we just wait and do nothing. But timing actually means preparation. Yes. That's what it looks like in God's eyes. And that's why it takes so long, because we need to be prepared for what he wants us to do.
Exactly.
We need to be, ready and equipped to do the work that he wants us to do. Because in the way that we are, we will either break it or we will destroy ourselves in the process. So timing is actually preparation. That's what it is. And when we stop looking at the clock and start actually living in the moment of preparation and accepting it and cultivating it, and showing up to be prepared to be cultivated, I think it changes the waiting game for you a little bit. But you'd never ever ever come out the same if you wait it out the way that God intends you to,
and just be surrendered to that process, because like you're saying, the waiting season is possibly the most important.
Very important.
We like to make the example of giving a 5-year-old a Ferrari. I'm a mother. If my child came and asked me for a Ferrari, if I could afford to give her a Ferrari anyways, I wouldn't just give my 5-year-old a Ferrari. You know what I mean? Because they're not ready to handle something of that much value. And in a lot of ways, God is the same with us. He knows what we're destined for. He knows that, we are purposed to do fantastic and phenomenal things.
He created us to do that.
Things. Exactly. Things that will ultimately change the trajectory of not just our lives, but the lives of so many people. But if we're not ready, he won't give it to us. He won't allow us to step into that place until he sees that we're ready. So that waiting season is very important. Okay, so we've gotten the backstory of Moses. For those of you who didn't know the full story, thank you, Shishi. And we sort of understand the layering of who he really was in his, prime as Prince of Egypt. But let's backtrack a little bit and talk about the elements of his brokenness, even in that state. So when we look at him, I imagine one of the things that he started coming into understanding, and they built sort of this, a foundation for brokenness, is the fact that he felt maybe rejected, right? So rejection may have came into the fray, because I imagine growing up, yes, you are a prince by technicality, but I mean, your peers know the real story, your cousins know the real story. So I imagine growing up, he got that a lot. He got the, you're not really... you're a prince, but you're not for real.
Not for real.
That sort of rejection by society, but also the idea that as a child, maybe he didn't understand why his mother did what she did, and as a child, maybe he didn't understand fully the fact that his mother had to sort of sacrifice and take him away to keep him safe, because she knew that there was something on his life, but he grew up with that rejection. So rejection, definitely.
But also, maybe let's just say it was a secret, right? Maybe it was something that was kept on the low, down low, and it was only something that maybe his adopted mother knew. I would like to also think that he looked different. He was Hebrew after all, right?
Yes.
So physically, he may not have looked like an Egyptian, and maybe that would have been a thing that would always mess with his self-esteem.
Exactly.
Maybe he had darker skin tone, maybe because the Hebrew people were very hairy, right? So maybe that's another cultural thing. The Egyptians shaved every hair on their face, right? They were bald, they used to wear wigs and stuff. So maybe his hair grew a lot quicker and he had to continuously shave it. Like maybe these odd physical traits or attributes would stick out and they would expose him. Maybe the color of his eyes was different.
Definitely.
And that would stab at his self-esteem. So definitely rejection.
Definitely rejection. So I mean, the traits that we are talking about or discovering that Moses might have struggled with of brokenness are definitely rejection, definitely self-esteem, and I think identity,
definitely,
right? Because of everything we've spoken about, who am I?
Yes.
Right?
Where do I belong?
And the older he got, the more and more he got faced with these questions of who am I? Where do I come from? What are my people? What does that even mean? And I think even if he didn't have all of the external influences that were causing him to question himself, I think internally you know, that feeling when you know you just don't fit. You know, and we've all experienced this some way or another, where we can say, man, no, like I just felt different. Like from the inside, it's just, I don't feel good, you know. And for him, he had to really deal with this for many years into his life, and from childhood to adulthood, and these questions of, where do I come from? Why don't I fit in? Why am I different? So his identity was an area of contention, and it also contributed to some of the broken elements and the broken characteristics of his life.
And something I want to add to that as well, just the internal conflict more than anything. There was a period where the Pharaoh's daughter, Moses' adopted mother, chose Moses' maternal mother to raise him for 3 years. To be his nursemaid, right? For a good 3 years. And you can imagine that she was trying to teach him the ways of the one true God. And I think spiritually, internally, there was a clash. There was a conflict. Because we know how important our reformative years are as children. Definitely. Right? So obviously it's stuck in his child head for the 3 years that there is, you know, God, there's a one God, and his purpose, he's chosen. Then he comes into a completely different culture who have like 100 gods, you know, and who worship and pray to all these different gods. And I think spiritually, he may have really had an internal struggle because he remembers something that was taught to him when he was a baby, but he's just inundated with so many other things that it must have been just very altering for him. Confusing.
Yeah, definitely. So those are just some of the areas of brokenness already Moses as the prince of Egypt is dealing with, right? And we're just trying to paint this picture to show you that in every area of life, I mean, it may sound like Moses was living soft life. He's royalty, he's all of that. But look at those broken elements already. You know, these are the things that we have to deal with as people. I mean, your status doesn't make you run away from brokenness. You know, your position in the world, your money, you know, your power does not make you run away from the things that you have to deal with every single day, the things that form part of your makeup, you know, the fabric of who you are. You can't hide that behind a bank balance. You can't hide that behind a status, right? So these are some of the elements of brokenness that we think that Moses may have had to contend with as the prince of Egypt. So fast forward to, he kills the Egyptian, he runs off, and he thinks to himself, you know what? I'm going to start afresh. Nobody knows me here. I can literally live my life. I can do what I want to do. I don't have to be a felon or a fugitive.
I don't have to play royalty.
To play a royal role in this thing that I don't fit in.
Yes, I don't have to feel validated.
It's a blank slate. Yeah. So he goes into the wilderness and he becomes a shepherd, and he marries Zipporah, and Zipporah's family takes him in, and he basically has a new family. He basically has a new identity, or so he thinks.
Yes.
Right? 80 years on, God meets him in the wilderness in the form of a burning bush. We all know the story. You want to take it?
I think for me, one of the biggest keys that I took away from his wilderness experience was he needed to deal with the shame of the killing, the murder, right? Because I don't think he would have been able to, and it's beautiful because I think with God, there's always a repentance story. It always boils down to repentance, right? So are you repentant and are you surrendered to the will of God? Because
you know what I think it is?
Yeah.
It's the recognition. You know how in the AA they'll tell you the first step to overcoming an addiction is admitting.
Yes.
It's that element of, this is something wrong within me. I recognize it and I own it. I need your help to fix it.
Yes. And I think that's really one of the many reasons the wilderness was so appropriate for him. Because, yes, God was dealing with all the other stuff that he latched onto him while he was in the palace, right, in royalty. But also that, I think, was a defining moment for him, because it was through that action that made him realize, I did something wrong here. You know, he killed a slave. He killed somebody. I'm pretty sure in royalty at the time, they could have done whatever they wanted. They would have been exiled or anything like that. But I think it was a defining moment for him that he recognized that this was wrong. So I'm going to run away and hide. So his 40 years really was just for him to form, to surrender to the will of God and to accept, like you're saying, to admit to the fact that I messed up and I'm going to do it God's way. And I think once he came to that realization, God is like, okay, I can finally meet you.
I can work with you.
And I can work with you and I can send you. you know, so and that's true. The story of all of our lives.
True. And it has to start with surrender.
Yes.
You know, that acceptance.
Yes.
That acceptance of the fact that, you know what, I'm not good, I need help, is called surrender.
Yeah.
Because God cannot work with people who don't think they need him. You know, he cannot work with individuals who don't need him.
Yeah.
Ultimately. And for us to actually open ourselves up, for God to come in and take our brokenness and piece it together for something that makes sense, requires a level of, here I am, I'm imperfect, I'm broken, I'm a mess, but I need you.
Yeah.
And that was his time to
Definitely.
do that, you know?
And I think it was also so beautiful because faith is really also one of the biggest elements to surrender where God is concerned. So he married into also a pagan household. Yes. So they were not believers, right? They didn't believe like the Hebrew people believed in Elohim and the one true God. His father-in-law Jethro was a pagan, and he married a pagan ultimately. So even in the 40 years that he was there, he wasn't cultivating a relationship with God because he was never exposed to it. So for 80 years of his life, he's just exposed to different gods. But like Shishi said, when the Spirit acknowledges that there's more, right? And I think it's also such a beautiful journey God has with all of us, because he keeps drawing you to him and you don't even know. And he just pulls and he pulls and he pulls and he pulls. And that moment with the burning bush was really just that, because God met him where he was broken. He met him in his brokenness, and he acknowledged him in that at that moment. And Moses was willing to be met by God. You know, for me, that's also the beautiful part. And of course, God spoke to him in this bush, and he told Moses that this is holy ground. He must take off his feet. You know, and that's also another form of surrender. And Moses did, and God basically told him that, okay, you're here, I got you here, that's great, but I need you to go back. Right? So all the stuff you're running away from, all the people you've been hiding from for the last 40 years, I need you to go face them, because you need to free my people.
Remember,
it may be broken, but it's in the hands of the potter.
Catch you next time, guys. Bye.